Anthony and David, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having
Great to be here.
and us.
David, how did you come across Group Commander J.N. Stagg in the first place? And what made you think that his story wouldn't be just a footnote to history, but really the focus of what would become not just a great play, but then a great screenplay and movie as well?
Well, in 2011, a very distinguished theatre in Scotland, in Edinburgh, the Royal Lyceum Theatre, approached John Dove, who was a theatre director, and myself, and asked if we could find a hero on the sidelines of history who was Scottish. And so we researched, and up came James Stagg and his extraordinary contribution to the landings of D-Day and the future, you could even argue, of Western civilization, because this Second World War had to be won. It had to be won on so many fronts, and he was a serious contributor to that victory. And I started writing the stage play, and I thought it was an irresistible story.
Well, you certainly can't overstate the importance of D-Day, and I also think it's important for our audience to understand how meticulous you were in your research. It wasn't just historical records of the military campaign, but we're talking meteorological records, conversations with the family. Can you tell us a little bit more about his background, what enabled him to be the type of person that Churchill would send to Eisenhower for the most important operation of the war?
He was the son of a plumber from a small village near Edinburgh, Dalkeith, and I personally, actually, I have a personal thing here. I have some Scottish blood in me myself, but the traits I have always admired more than almost anything else in certain Scots is this integrity and honesty that is disguised within a certain peremptory bluntness. And I find it an incredibly appealing trait. And I think Anthony would probably sort of support the theory that it's a fascinating character to deal with, particularly for you, Anthony, filmically, because so much is going on inside, so little is revealed on the exterior, that it's fascinating to investigate one of those human beings, as it were. You know that there's so much ticking on the inside.
One of the things that I found really compelling, I guess, about Stagg's character was how he evolves in the screenplay, and how you go in looking at this character one way and you get a very different picture of him by the end. But then you kind of think, well, where did that transition happen? Where did it happen? And I think what's beautiful about the screenplay, also about how Andrew arrived at the performance, is that Stagg's almost like a storm. He comes into the halls of Suffolk House and he takes no prisoners. He means business. He's hyper confident and he doesn't suffer fools. He's not really, quote unquote, likable in the typical sense. And what becomes fascinating is that you see this storm come through and everyone's kind of on edge because he's a force. But then you see the clouds start to sort of open a little bit and you get this big burst of humanity, of sunlight through the clouds. And it might be a simple thing where he's talking about his wife, or he's on the phone, a very important phone call that happens in the film, or something that happens at the end of the film. And it results in a picture of a man who you thought was just this wound up, strict sort of disciplinarian meteorologist. And you realize there's this big heart beneath him. And I think the sort of way that Andrew is able to oscillate between those two worlds, you see a full picture of a guy under pressure. And that speaks to the bigger picture of what the film's about, and what, on a very basic level, makes it fascinating. You got the world's most brilliant minds locked in a room trying to second guess nature and watching them kind of go insane over this 3-day period as they're trying to figure out, do we launch the biggest invasion in history, seaborne invasion in history, or don't we? It is important to remember, as David said, these were the greatest minds the Allied world had to offer. They all wanted the same thing. They wanted to win. They cared really deeply and passionately about, what it was that they were doing. And to watch not just these men or personalities, but their ideologies, their points of view on how the world works clash against one another, as you know, as a filmmaker, is inherently dramatic.
The movie starts off with uncertainty and chaos and things that cannot be controlled. And that's a series of accidents that happened during Operation Tiger, one of the practice landings for the Normandy invasion. German torpedo boats sink a number of Allied landing craft. And of course, you show the friendly fire incident where naval gunfire kills Allied troops, American troops that are under Eisenhower's command. In fact, Eisenhower insisted that live fire take place to make the practice more realistic.
Mm-hmm.
What were you all trying to show in terms of what this does to Eisenhower and his willingness to assume risk as the planning and decision-making went forward for the 6th June invasion?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there was another reason for it, though. It went to Eisenhower's character, but from a very basic story construction point. It's how do you show the consequences of failure to the audience of, if we make a mistake, what does it look like on the other side? And so upon learning that there was this massive dress rehearsal for D-Day, it was only 6 weeks out, went horrifically wrong, and more died in Exercise Tiger than on Utah Beach. The soldiers that were at Exercise Tiger, those troops, would go on to Utah Beach. More died in the training exercise than at Utah. And I just felt that, after we looked at the multitude of different ways you could start this film, that it was really important to show the consequences of failure, so that for the rest of the film, it has a different kind of power when you're watching these like fraught discussions about whether and do we invade now and are the Germans going to find out and all this sort of stuff, because it comes down to, if we screw up, forget about the hundreds that died at Exercise Tiger. When we're facing Nazis, bunkered up on a fortified position, which is pretty much the hardest military thing to do, to invade across water to a defensive position, we're going to be slaughtered. And that has to hang over all their heads for the tension to work, and also to reflect what actually happened in real life. It was driving Ike mad throughout the course of the film. It's why he's smoking throughout the course of history and the film. It's why he was smoking 4 to 6 packets of cigarettes a day. He's drinking 20 cups of coffee. Like, can you imagine? I'm on my first cup now. I'd be a nightmare by 20 cups.
So Eisenhower's under this enormous amount of pressure, as you are able to show the audience from the beginning. In fact, he's very concerned about the uncertainty. At one point, Brendan Fraser, as Eisenhower says, strongly, I need certainty from Stagg. So David, tell us about why certainty in the weather is so important for the D-Day operation.
Well, one of the principal reasons is that the landing craft were antiquated and archaic and flat-bottomed. So anything over about force 5 would have been potentially lethal and could have caused as many as 80 to 100,000 deaths, added to which it may not have changed, it probably wouldn't have changed the course of the war, but certainly it would have elongated the war and caused a huge number of extra casualties on mainland Europe. And so to get that forecast right had colossal potential repercussions for Western civilization, no less.
There's also the moon, for the paratroopers to land. They didn't have night vision, obviously. Yeah. So they needed the moon. The tides had to be a certain level so that the boats could go in.
Yeah.
But, if D-Day wasn't a success, though, a lot of people talk about this and they're like, okay, well, the Soviets were already on their way through to Germany and they would have rolled over them. Yes, true. But then what does Europe look like after that? So had they not got on the continent then, there are multiple scenarios that could have eventuated. There could have been a treaty where, west of the Rhine or west of some point, it's Nazi, and to the other side, it's Soviet. It could have been the case that the entire continental Europe was Soviet. It's history now because it happened. Anything in war anything can happen in war, and I don't think it's as clear cut as saying, well, the Soviets were our allies, and so we would have been good. They were by that stage in 1944. There were already proxy wars going on between the Soviets and the West, specifically in Greece. Like, the reason my family came to Australia is they were caught up in that war, whereas the Soviets were backing one side of the fight, the West was backing the other side, and they were already fighting one another, these proxy wars. So it's not as, a lot of people say, oh, I know about history, and, well, no, the Allies were already good. It's more complex than that, and
Yeah.
what a lot of these people were doing was trying to project forward past the immediate piece, and what does Europe and the world look like after that. Continental Europe could be speaking German or Russian or a combination of the both, if this had not succeeded. So they were very well aware of those stakes, Eisenhower in particular.
So you have tides, you have cloud cover, you have moonlight, you have sea conditions. And amongst some of the allies, and particularly the British, led by Montgomery at this point, he is concerned that if there is a delay to the invasion, this is going to increase the risk that the invasion itself isn't a success. Can you tell us a little bit about, I guess, two things? One, what was the tension between Eisenhower and Montgomery on a personal level? And I guess for Anthony, what did you want Damian Lewis to bring out in that sort of division of ideas, that debate between Ike and Montgomery?
I think it's an interesting debate. I mean, that impetuosity of Montgomery and his desire to go whatever were actually admirable features to an extent. It's just that they were so poorly founded on the facts in this particular case. But what did you feel, Anthony? What did you want from Montgomery in the film, particularly?
I just felt that you had, you had a titanic figures across the Allied leadership. You had Ramsey, you had obviously Eisenhower, you had Montgomery, you had Bradley, you had many others. But I think of all of them, Montgomery being, the head of all the Allied land forces, was hyper capable, cared deeply about his troops, but also had the bigger picture in mind. And just as thematically, or just as, like, from a dramatic point of view, Stagg had his critic, Ike had his Monty. And that's not to say that someone's just squabbling for the sake of squabbling. Montgomery had a real point, like you bring up, Mark, which is, we can wait as much as we want. We wait too long, it's all going to be for nothing. You can't just keep these men housed up like that. And how are you going to seal the lips of hundreds of thousands of men? And I think his character, from a dramatic point of view, is really important to show that the kinds of tensions that Ike was fighting were not just weather. They were a multitude of other factors. Like in the film, we go into some detail, on the diversion tactics and the sort of, the inflatable tanks and ships and all of these sort of things that Montgomery had spearheaded, kind of like a magician. You were showing the film, as in history, that it wasn't just this one-pronged effort. It was land, air, sea, subterfuge, secrecy, second guessing the weather. Like, it was this massive effort that was all coming together. And Monty represented a big part of that. He's also just a great character. Like, I'm going to bastardize the quote, I'm sure, but Churchill said something which, always kind of chuckle at, where he said something like, in battle, indispensable. It's about Montgomery. In battle, indispensable. In victory, unbearable. And, that was Monty, where you wanted him on your side, but, oh, God, you're going to hear about it once he starts gloating.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Stagg. I mean, you've set up the pressure that Stagg is under. He has Eisenhower, he has Montgomery, he has the weather. Stagg understands the enormity of what's about to happen and the consequences of the forecast, and he needs to get it right. As Ike says, I need you to be certain. What do you each think that's enabled Stagg to cope with that pressure? Or, as you show in the film, he has challenges, but he ultimately gets through. As you say, he evolves and adapts the situation. What enables him to do that, and what do you want the audience to understand about Stagg's evolution as he tries to adapt to that pressure.
I think the crucial thing that we're talking about is how he manages to defeat his own demons, his own uncertainty, his own knowledge that weather is always inevitably uncertain. How any human being, any man in that situation, manages to suppress the fear and the chaos within him to make the decision as well as he can, to, in its simplest terms, do his job as well as he can.
And he's doing this job without satellites, without global forecasts.
Yeah.
How difficult is it for meteorologists in 1944 to give a fairly reasonable prediction of the weather?
Yeah, well, quite. Actually, Anthony, you did a lot of work in the later drafts on the variety of information and data was always very important to you, wasn't it, in the screenplay? So you brought in a lot of these external sources. I mainly dealt with the clash between Crick's philosophy with synoptic charts in the past and Stagg and the Europeans' nascent understanding of the jet stream and that current's power, and weather balloons and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that it was a natural evolution of what was already there. But, I think what sets Stagg apart from many of the other characters is, frankly, his ability to live with uncertainty. And it's something that he, as a meteorologist and also as an explorer, in a sense, like he was not, in a lab his whole life. He was out in the Arctic on weather ships at sub-zero temperatures for months, years at a time. He's a tough dude, and he'd seen a lot. It's not just, again, he's not just reading maps. Like, he was out there in the teeth of the weather in his formative years as meteorology as a science was being developed. It wasn't obviously what it is today. And the more that we got into the research, it wasn't just his skills as a meteorologist. In fact, that's not the key reason he was there. He was kind of like the head of the octopus who, as Ike had to decide ultimately, do we go or don't we go, Stagg had to decide, what's the weather going to be? Now, how does he do that? There are thousands, if not tens of thousands or more data points coming in from all around the world. They've got, planes, and they've got balloons they're sending up in the Arctic and in the deserts and in Newfoundland and at bases off the Atlantic. They even had French resistance members with little weather balloon kits and transmitters and stuff setting off balloons in France to get the details from them. Like, it was a really big effort. Ultimately, all of that data has got to come in and be synthesized somewhere and has to be analyzed somewhere. There was no computers, there was no computer-driven algorithms. It was human brain and human brawn in the sense of hands physically pushing pencils around. But ultimately, someone had to make that call. And so what Stagg had the unenviable task of doing was he had beneath him a number of different meteorologists, who were saying it's going to be sunny and it's going to be great, or it's going to be an absolute storm, and everything in between. And so we tried to build this idea of Stagg obviously having his own very clear meteorological opinion on things, but he's also having to synthesize stuff that all these other team members, including Crick, are bringing to him. And again, it's that idea of watching this clash of how we see the world, not just personalities. It's personalities as well, but it's how we see the world. And it brings up something interesting with Crick, where, it's easy to say looking back, oh, he got it right or he got it wrong. And yes, in that particular time, he got it wrong, just for the D-Day call. But he was one of the most esteemed meteorologists on Earth at that point.
Absolutely.
Now, his methods may have been outdated now, but he was advising the biggest Hollywood productions, as you see in the film. He was right in 90+% of the campaign in North Africa. He was trusted by Ike, and he understood something that Stagg didn't, which was, and this goes back to, bring up the ancient Greek stuff, what Aristotle would say. It's not just what you say, it's who says it and how you say it that makes an impact, because there has to be an element of trust between leadership and those advising them. And Crick understood that. Like, there's a line in the script where he goes, what are you talking about? I know him. being referring to Eisenhower, whereas Stagg's like, what difference does that make? The facts are the facts. And what Stagg comes to learn through all of this is everyone's really busy. Everyone's got a lot of stuff on their mind. What Stagg's big, immediate obstacle is in this film is I'm Cassandra. I can see into the future. No one else would believe me. How do I get my point across? And, there's a point in the film where he's just like, F it. I'm just going to tell you exactly how I feel, because at a certain point, the data stops working. The data can only work so far. You also have to connect on a human level, and Stagg learns to do that at a certain point and earns Ike's trust. As he had in real life, we've compressed the timeline a little bit into how long that all took, but those dynamics were very important to capture.
In the modern AI enterprise, adversaries no longer break in, they log in. As autonomous AI agents and machines gain privileged access, your risk is becoming invisible, and legacy tools can't keep up. Introducing Idera from Palo Alto Networks. Idera is the next-generation identity platform built for the scale of the AI workforce. It helps you discover hidden risks instantly, eliminate static privileges with just-in-time enforcement, and automate governance at machine speed. Secure every identity, human, machine, and agentic, with Idera by Palo Alto Networks. Visit paloaltonetworks.com/IDIRA to get started.
Chris Messina's playing Crick as very flamboyant. Again, as you spoke about, of the Hollywood darling. This is what he was like in real life, and how did this help you to recreate these intense clashes that he has with Stagg?
It's exactly what he was like.
I'm going to read you something.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm going to read you something. This is fresh off the press. So this is from Facebook 1 week ago. So Irv Crick, who is the son of Irvin Crick, has seen the trailer. Here's what he wrote. Yes. I just saw this. He says to Teresa Priley, who I guess is his friend, "My dad certainly was a controversial character. We'll see how close the movie describes to what I know. But my dad said, time after time, he just didn't like this guy, James Stagg." Right? And so, assuming that is the real Irv Crick, which Irv, I guess it is you, my dad was certainly a confident guy and frankly caught a lot of flack about his method. But guess what? They work so well that this day, his company survives to this day. That tension was there, and there was no love lost, but there was a grudging respect, I think.
He was there to after the war to make money as well. I mean, he sold his cloud seeding techniques, to produce rain in the Middle East, which was a pretty dubious meteorological half-truth, and made a huge amount of money for it. And his book is very flattering about Irving Crick, his memoir. But and he looked a bit like Clark Gable, didn't he? I mean, he was just a great character. But as you say, Anthony, a very, very sound meteorologist, very respected, and using a system that did work on a large landmass, on a big continental basis. Those synoptic charts worked.
As you both said, one of Stagg's responsibilities is to take these divergent forecasts that are coming from the European team, from the Americans, and figure out a way through. And it's not just a matter of the data; it's a matter of the personalities. And Kay Summersby plays a very important role in this. And tell us how you wanted Kay Summersby to be portrayed. I mean, she's not just a driver for Eisenhower. She's a very important confidant, someone maybe even a more important chief of staff than General Beadle Smith was for Eisenhower.
Yeah. I think that's right. And she was my favorite character when writing the stage play for many reasons. One of which is that there are very, very few women in that era who had such agency, who managed to be so resilient and influential within that patriarchal male world. And I can think of a tonally resonant similarity in Imitation Game with Joy Clark, isn't it? That was her name, who was the cryptologist who helped Turing. And again, you know, they paid her less. They paid Joy Clark less. She had to pretend she was doing a completely different job to get into the hut that was interpreting the data, you know, on the computer. And similarly with Kay Summersby, yes, she could open the bonnet of Ike's car and mend, you know, as a very qualified mechanic. She was a confidant. She was a brilliant PA. And she, even that, as I say, it sounds vaguely patriarchal, actually, but I don't mean it to, because there were so few women who had that energy and desire to influence, and also such importance within a story like this. So I was always very, very fond of Kay, and I'm very fond of the interdependency of the two of them within the story. That there was something about what Kay could offer Eisenhower that helped him survive the chaos, physical chaos that Anthony was alluding to earlier, the cigarettes, the coffee, the sores on his back. You know, I mean, just that sheer relentless pressure that she was able to help him come through.
David and Anthony, what do you hope audiences take away from this film about D-Day, about uncertainty, about leadership, and of course about pressure once they've seen the film?
I think there is something innately heroic, not in a Marvel films type way heroic, but quietly heroic in all the protagonists. I think Eisenhower, in the deliberate sagacity of his trust and choice, Stagg, up against pressure on the point of cracking, sticking to his guns and saying what he believed to be true, and Kay Summersby helping to solve a problem between the leaders of this situation, becoming indispensable to the outcome of this choice. And so all three of those main protagonists share a quiet heroism, which I think would be a great thing to communicate and would resonate nowadays, when so many choices are impulsive and fast and reactive, and they treated choice and deliberation and the importance of their choices in a very different way. And that's something that really strikes me about the film and about the story.
David, in fact, one of my colleagues used to say that genius on the battlefield was the ability to reconcile the fog and of war and the friction that comes with it. And what you've described is really the genius of Stagg and being able to reconcile that for leadership.
Yeah.
Anthony, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that in Stagg, you've got a character who's willing to look the most powerful men on Earth pretty much at this time, and that Allied leadership is willing to look them in the eye and tell them what he knows they don't want to hear, but what he knows that they need to hear. And, you know, I think there's power in that example. I think Stagg, the meteorologist, is like a rock who is unflappable and who you want on your side and who's willing to tell the truth. And in times of crisis, you want people who aren't going to give you BS, but who are going to basically tell it as it is, as they say. And I think that in the world that we live in now, that quality gets rarer and rarer, as is the qualities that Eisenhower showed in the lead up to D-Day, where you have a portrait of a leader who cares deeply about his men, who agonizes over their fate, and who fundamentally just wants to do the right thing. And, you know, you only have to look to the history at what Eisenhower did on the eve of D-Day in writing two letters. One In victory, he commended the troops and gave them the victory. Said it was because of the troops' bravery that they won. And yet he wrote another letter in case of defeat and said all responsibility rested with him. I wish we had leaders across the world like that today. I think the kind of world that we live in and the news cycle that we have makes that sort of style of leadership get rarer and rarer. But it helped us through some of the toughest times that we faced, at least in the West. And there's honor there, and it should be commended. Like when you've got someone like Eisenhower in mind, who had 1 million men or so behind him in terms of troops and how many people were in that logistics chain. 1 million men, but he's all alone ultimately to make that decision. I think we can learn about who we are by looking at how other people in times of absolute crisis, how they deal with that crisis and how they deal with that pressure. And I think, if anything, what pressure gets to is how do you bring your best self to the table when all the chips are down, when you don't know all the answers and you've got to make some of the biggest decisions of your life like that, beyond war, beyond history. It's a story, it's a fable about that. How do you make the best decision? And the whole film is about one decision, and it's exciting to see these characters smash up against one another as they try and get the answer to that question.
And a final question for you, David. Do you think Eisenhower, in the end, understood the importance that Stagg and the other meteorologists played in helping him to make the right decision?
I do, and he rather wittily says that the success of D-Day was because we had better weather forecasters than the Germans. So I think he did understand that, and but he understood something deeper as well, that Anthony and I have tried to articulate in what those two men, actually, if we're talking about Eisenhower and Stagg, stood for. Yeah.
Well, he said that to JFK at his inauguration. It was the first question JFK asked him: "What gave us the edge on D-Day?"
Yeah.
And it's just interesting that at the same time that Eisenhower is responding, as you described, we had better meteorologists than the Germans. I was going to say Andrew Scott, he played the thing so well, but James Stagg just went back to a quiet life in England, continuing to study meteorology. And it's not all heroes wear capes. Sometimes they walk out of their house, they check some barometric pressure, they save the world, and they just go home again and be with their wife and kids. And that's kind of what Stagg did. So there's something noble in that.
Gentlemen, I think that's the perfect place to end it today. The movie is Pressure, the untold story behind D-Day. It's out in theaters now. David Haig, Anthony Maris, thank you so much for joining us on SpyCast today.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it very much.